Judge laughs at John Kennedy in court, but is left stunned by his legal genius. The courtroom hummed with a quiet tension, the kind that settles in when everyone assumes they know how the story ends. John Kennedy stood at the defendant's table, his suit slightly frayed at the cuffs, his tie a touch off-center, but his stance was firm grounded, like a man who'd faced bigger battles and walked away unbroken. He wasn't a lawyer, never pretended to be, but he was here for something deeper than any law degree could grant his family's home, the one his parents had built with years of sacrifice, now threatened by a corporate giant that saw it as just another line item to claim. Across the aisle, Bryce Sterling, the bank's attorney, adjusted his cufflinks with a practiced ease, his smirk radiating confidence. Sterling was a legal titan known for crushing small-time challengers like Kennedy without breaking a sweat. The gallery, a mix of corporate suits and curious onlookers, mirrored his certainty, their whispers carrying a tone of inevitability. Judge Walter Grayson presided from the bench. His glasses low on his nose, his expression a mix of boredom and faint amusement as he toyed with his gavel. "Mr. Kennedy Grayson," said, his voice laced with a condescension that didn't bother hiding itself. "You're representing yourself?" The question drew a few stifled chuckles from the corporate side. Kennedy met the judge's gaze unflinching. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. The laughter faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. Sterling leaned toward his assistant, muttering something just loud enough for Kennedy to hear, a calculated jab meant to unsettle him. But Kennedy stood firm. He'd been dismissed before, counted out by those who thought they knew better, and he'd learned to carry that weight. It's why he was here, not just to argue, but to prove them wrong. This was a foreclosure dispute, a challenge to the bank's claim on Kennedy's family home. On paper, it was simple. The bank, represented by Sterling, argued that the Kennedys had defaulted on their mortgage, and the property was legally seized. The law, Sterling would claim, was clear contracts, signed payments, missed case, closed. But Kennedy saw it differently. This wasn't about missed payments. It was about a system that preyed on families exploiting fine print to strip away what mattered most. For months, he'd buried himself in legal texts, case law, and every document tied to the foreclosure, teaching himself what no one expected him to know. He wasn't a lawyer, but he'd found something the bank didn't want, seen a crack in their story. Grayson flipped through the case file, barely glancing at Kennedy. "You think you can take on Mr. Sterling here?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd already written the outcome. Kennedy didn't blink. "I don't think—" "Your Honor, I know." The room stilled, the air shifting as heads turned. Sterling let out a soft, mocking laugh, adjusting his tie as if to brush off the audacity. But there was something in Kennedy's voice, a quiet certainty that made the laughter feel thin. Grayson raised an eyebrow, his amusement fading slightly. "Well then," he said, leaning back, "let's see it." Sterling rose, buttoning his tailored jacket with a flourish, and strode toward the jury with the ease of a man who owned the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and assured, "this is a straightforward case. My client, a respected financial institution, followed the law. The defendant's family failed to meet their obligations, and the property was foreclosed upon legally. This isn't about emotion. It's about contracts and responsibility. The numbers don't lie." He paused, casting a glance at Kennedy without turning his head, a subtle dismissal. "Mr. Kennedy may want you to think this is some grand injustice, but the law doesn't bend for sentiment." He shrugged, as if the case was already won, and sat down, his assistant nodding in approval. The jury, a mix of bored and attentive faces, seemed to buy Sterling's story. It was familiar, a bank doing business, a family falling short. Clean, predictable. Kennedy stood, his movements measured, deliberate. He adjusted his tie, not for show, but because he knew they were watching, judging every detail. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen." He began, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. The law is clear. But the question is whether his client followed it." A murmur stirred the gallery, soft but noticeable. Sterling's smirk twitched just for a moment. Kennedy continued, his gaze moving from the judge to the jury. "I've spent months studying this case, every document, every statute, every move this bank made. And what I found isn't just a mistake. It's a pattern." Grayson leaned forward slightly, his fingers pausing on the gavel. Sterling's assistant whispered something, but Kennedy didn't pause. "This isn't about one family's struggle. It's about a system that counts on people not knowing enough to fight. But I know, and I'm here to show you what they're hiding." The room felt different now, the air charged. The corporate suits in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence wavering. Grayson's expression shifted, a flicker of curiosity replacing his boredom. Sterling leaned forward, his voice cutting in. "Your Honor, this is theater, not evidence. The defendant is spinning a story to dodge the facts." Kennedy turned to him, his eyes steady. "Facts, Mr. Sterling. Like the fact that your client's mortgage documents don't add up." He reached into his folder, pulling out a single sheet and handed it to the bailiff. "I'd like to submit this, Your Honor. It's the original mortgage agreement, and it has something that doesn't belong." Grayson took the document, scanning it closely. The room held its breath. Kennedy stepped back, his voice steady. "That document shows a signature that isn't my mother's. It's on a filing used to justify the foreclosure. I'm no expert, but I know her signature, and that's not it." The gallery stirred, whispers breaking out. Sterling's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. Grayson looked up, his tone sharper. "Mr. Kennedy, you're saying this signature is forged?" Kennedy nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, and I'm requesting discovery to prove it's part of something bigger." Grayson leaned back, his fingers tapping the bench. "That's a bold claim. You'd better have more." Kennedy met his gaze. "I do, Your Honor, and I will." The corporate side was quieter now, their whispers replaced by tension. They'd expected a quick win, a formality. But Kennedy wasn't playing their game. He was rewriting it, document by document, truth by truth. The jury, once disengaged, now watched him closely, sensing something bigger unfolding. Sterling's confidence was fraying, his assistant scribbling frantically. Kennedy stood tall, his worn suit a symbol of defiance. They'd laughed at him, dismissed him, but he'd known they would. He'd felt that judgment before, and it had only made him sharper, more determined. The bank thought they could take his home because they had power. Sterling thought he'd win because he always did. Grayson thought this was just another case. They were all wrong. Kennedy was here to fight, and he was just getting started. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour ago. The air, once thick with the smug certainty of an inevitable outcome, now crackled with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. John Kennedy stood at the defendant's table, his worn suit and slightly crooked tie no longer drawing snickers from the gallery. The corporate representatives, who had been whispering confidently at the start, now sat in rigid silence, their eyes darting between Kennedy and the polished figure of Bryce Sterling across the aisle. Sterling, for his part, was trying to maintain his air of control, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed him. He hadn't expected Kennedy to come this far, to stand toe-to-toe with him in a legal arena where he was supposed to be untouchable. Judge Walter Grayson, perched above them all, had shed his earlier amusement, his glasses now pushed up as he leaned forward studying the document Kennedy had submitted. The signature discrepancy Kennedy had pointed out wasn't just a minor error. It was a crack in the foundation of the bank's case, and everyone in the room could feel it. Mr. Kennedy Grayson said, his voice measured but carrying a new weight. "You've made a serious accusation about this signature. Let's hear more." Kennedy nodded, his expression calm but resolute. He knew this was his moment to strike, to widen that crack, until the whole case came tumbling down. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Your Honor," Kennedy began, his voice steady, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "This case isn't just about a house. It's about trust. Trust that the system we all rely on operates fairly, that the rules apply to everyone, not just those who can afford to bend them." He paused, letting his words settle, his gaze sweeping across the jury. They were listening now, their earlier indifference replaced by curiosity, maybe even a spark of admiration. "The document I submitted shows a signature that doesn't belong to my mother. It's on a mortgage modification filed just months after the original agreement, and it was used to justify the foreclosure of our family's home. But that's not the only problem." He reached into his folder, pulling out another set of papers, and walked them to the bailiff. "These are records of the bank's foreclosure process, and if you look closely, you'll see something else that doesn't add up." Grayson took the papers, his brow furrowing as he scanned them. Sterling shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping impatiently on the table, a telltale sign that he was feeling the pressure. Kennedy continued undeterred. "The bank claims they followed standard procedure, but their own documents tell a different story. The foreclosure notice was sent to an address my family hasn't lived at in years, and it was dated the same week my mother was recovering from a serious illness. How could she have signed anything?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the jury exchanging glances. Sterling stood, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is speculating again, trying to paint a narrative without evidence." But Grayson held up a hand, his eyes still on the papers. "Overruled. I want to hear where this is going." Kennedy nodded, a faint glint of determination in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor. The signature isn't just a mistake, it's a deliberate act, and to prove it, I'd like to call a witness." The room stirred, a low buzz of surprise spreading through the gallery. Sterling's head snapped up, his composure slipping for a moment. "A witness?" he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant didn't disclose any witnesses in pretrial filings." Kennedy turned to him, his voice even but firm. "That's because I only found her yesterday, Mr. Sterling. And what she has to say changes everything." Grayson leaned back, his expression unreadable but intrigued. "I'll allow it," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But this better be relevant, Mr. Kennedy." The courtroom doors creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, her steps hesitant but purposeful. She was middle-aged, her glasses perched nervously on her nose, her hands clutching a small purse, as she made her way to the witness stand. Kennedy watched her, his expression calm but focused. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Grayson said, his tone neutral but attentive. The woman cleared her throat, her voice soft but clear. "Ellen Carter, licensed notary public." A hush fell over the room, the weight of her presence sinking in. Kennedy stepped forward, his voice steady. "Ms. Carter, do you recall notarizing a mortgage modification for my mother, Clara Kennedy?" Carter hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Sterling's table before settling on Kennedy. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Kennedy nodded, giving her space to continue. "And were you present when my mother signed that document?" Another pause, longer this time. the silence heavy with anticipation. Carter's hands tightened on her purse. "No," she said at last, her voice trembling slightly. "I wasn't." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, the jury leaning forward, their eyes wide. Sterling shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. The witness can't." Grayson cut him off with a sharp look. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling. I want to hear this." Kennedy kept his focus on Carter, his voice gentle but probing. "Ms. Carter, if you weren't present, how did the document get notarized?" Carter swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to her lap. "I was given the paperwork by a bank representative," she said, her voice barely audible. "They told me it had already been signed, that I just needed to stamp it." The room erupted in murmurs, the corporate representatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Kennedy pressed forward, his tone calm but relentless. "So you're saying you notarized a signature you never saw signed?" Carter nodded, her face pale. "Yes, I didn't know it was wrong at the time. I trusted the bank." The admission hung in the air, a bombshell that shook the foundation of Sterling's case. Grayson leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Ms. Carter, do you understand the legal implications of what you're saying? Notarizing a document without witnessing the signature is a serious violation." Carter nodded, her eyes glassy. "Yes, Your Honor, I know that now." Kennedy stepped back, letting the weight of her words settle. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. No further questions." He returned to his table, his expression composed, but his mind racing. The notary's testimony wasn't just a crack in the bank's case. It was a wrecking ball. Sterling stood again, his voice tighter now, his earlier confidence fraying at the edges. "Your Honor, this testimony doesn't change the fact that the foreclosure followed legal procedure. The defendant is trying to distract from his family's failure to meet their obligations, but Grayson wasn't buying it. Mr. Sterling," he said, his tone firm, "a notarized signature that wasn't witnessed is not a minor detail. It calls the entire process into question." The jury was fully engaged, now their eyes moving between Kennedy and Sterling, sensing the shift in momentum. Kennedy seized the moment, his voice steady, but carrying a new intensity. "Your Honor, this isn't just about one document. It's about a pattern. The bank relied on this fake signature to push through a foreclosure they had no right to execute. And I believe discovery will show they've done this before, not just to my family, but to others." He pulled another document from his folder, holding it up for the jury to see. "This is a record of another foreclosure case handled by the same bank with the same kind of questionable paperwork. Same notary, same process. It's not a coincidence." Sterling's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant and prejudicial." But Grayson shook his head. "Overruled. I'm allowing it. Mr. Kennedy, submit the document." Kennedy handed it to the bailiff, his eyes never leaving Sterling's. The lawyer's composure was cracking, his earlier smirk replaced by a scowl. The corporate representatives in the gallery were no longer whispering, they were staring, their confidence replaced by unease. Grayson scanned the new document, his expression growing more serious. "Mr. Kennedy," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before, "you're building a case here. But you're walking a fine line. You'd better have more to back this up." Kennedy nodded, his voice steady. "I do, Your Honor. And with discovery I'll prove it's not just my family's home at stake. It's a system that's been taking advantage of people for years." The room was silent now, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. The jury, the gallery, even Sterling's assistant, all eyes were on Kennedy. He'd walked into this courtroom as an underdog, a man they'd laughed at, dismissed, as out of his depth. But now, with one witness and a handful of documents, he'd turned the tables. Sterling was scrambling, the bank's case was unraveling, and Grayson was listening. Kennedy knew he wasn't done yet. There was more to uncover, more to prove. But for the first time, he felt the room shift in his favor. The fight was far from over, but he'd just landed the first real blow, and it felt good. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, now the air thick with anticipation and unease. John Kennedy stood at the defendant's table, his worn suit no longer a point of mockery, but a quiet testament to his resolve. The gallery, once buzzing with dismissive whispers, sat in near silence. Their eyes locked on him. Bryce Sterling, the corporate lawyer who'd walked in with the swagger of a man who never lost, was visibly rattled, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. His assistant scribbled notes furiously, as if trying to keep up with a case that was slipping out of their control. Judge Walter Grayson, his earlier skepticism replaced by a focused intensity, leaned forward, his glasses reflecting the courtroom's harsh light as he scanned the latest document Kennedy had submitted. The notary's testimony had been a bombshell, revealing a forged signature that undermined the bank's foreclosure process. But Kennedy wasn't done. He knew the signature was just the beginning, a thread that if pulled would unravel a much larger web of deceit. Mr. Kennedy Grayson said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "You've made serious allegations about the bank's practices. You're claiming a pattern of misconduct. Let's see if you can substantiate it." Kennedy nodded, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with purpose. "I will, Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a quiet thunderclap. The jury, now fully engaged, leaned forward, their faces a mix of curiosity and growing respect. Kennedy was no longer the underdog they'd dismissed. He was a force, and the room could feel it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kennedy began, turning to the jury, his voice clear and deliberate. "This case started with my family's home, but it's bigger than that. It's about a bank that thinks it can bend the law because it has money and power. They thought no one would notice, no one would fight back. But I did notice, and I'm here to show you what they've been hiding." He reached into his folder, pulling out a thick stack of papers, each one meticulously annotated from months of sleepless nights and endless research. He handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to Grayson. "These documents, Your Honor, are records of the mortgage transfers for my family's home. The bank claims they legally acquired the loan and had the right to foreclose. But if you look at the transfer paperwork, you'll see something missing." Grayson flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he traced the lines with his finger. Kennedy continued, his voice steady but carrying a quiet intensity. "Every time a mortgage changes hands, there's supposed to be an endorsement, a legal record of the transfer from one lender to the next. But the last transfer, the one that gave this bank the supposed right to foreclose, has no endorsement, no signature, nothing. That means they never legally owned the loan in the first place." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the jury exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from intrigue to shock. Sterling shot to his feet, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "Objection, Your Honor. This is another attempt to confuse the issue. The defendant is throwing around baseless accusations without context." But Grayson held up a hand, his eyes still on the documents. "Overruled, Mr. Sterling. I'm interested in this. Sit down." Sterling hesitated, his face flushing as he sank back into his seat. Kennedy didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, this isn't just a paperwork error. It's a deliberate omission. Without that endorsement, the bank had no legal standing to foreclose on our home. And if they did it to us, they've done it to others. He pulled out another document, holding it up for the jury to see. This is a record of another foreclosure case by the same bank filed just last year. Same missing endorsement, same notary, same pattern. I've found 3 others just like it, and I believe discovery will uncover more. The gallery stirred the corporate representatives, whispering urgently among themselves, their earlier confidence now a distant memory. Grayson set the documents down, his expression darkening. Mr. Kennedy, you're suggesting this bank has been systematically bypassing legal requirements. That's a serious charge. Kennedy nodded, his voice unwavering. Yes, Your Honor, and I can back it up. These aren't isolated mistakes, they're a strategy. The bank counts on people not knowing their rights, not having the resources to fight back. They thought my family was just another number on a balance sheet. They were wrong. The jury was riveted now, their eye locked on Kennedy, some nodding slightly as his words hit home. Sterling, sensing the tide turning, leaned forward, his voice sharper than before. Your Honor, this is a distraction. The defendant is trying to turn a simple foreclosure case into a crusade. The law is clear. His family defaulted, and the bank acted within its rights. But Kennedy was ready. Within their rights, he said, turning to Sterling, his tone calm but cutting. How can you claim that when the bank didn't even own the loan? How can you foreclose on a property when your paperwork doesn't hold up? Sterling's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing, but he had no answer. The room felt it. The balance had shifted, and Kennedy was in control. Grayson leaned back, his fingers tapping the bench as he studied Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, you've presented compelling evidence, but you're walking a tightrope here. If you're going to accuse the bank of systemic fraud, you need more than documents. You need intent. Kennedy nodded, his mind racing, but his demeanor steady. I understand, Your Honor. That's why I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence. He reached into his folder, pulling out a single sheet of paper, its edges worn from being handled so many times. This is an internal memo from the bank obtained through a public records request. It instructs employees to expedite foreclosure processes by bypassing certain procedural steps to meet quarterly targets. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the jury's eyes widening as Kennedy handed the memo to the bailiff. Grayson took it, his expression unreadable, but his hands moving quickly as he scanned the text. This memo, Kennedy continued, shows the bank knowingly skipped legal requirements to seize homes faster. It's not just negligence, it's intent. Sterling was on his feet again, his voice bordering on desperate. Your Honor, this is outrageous. That document hasn't been authenticated, and the defendant is making wild claims to prejudice the jury. But Grayson wasn't having it. Mr. Sterling, he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through steel. If this memo is what Mr. Kennedy claims, it's highly relevant. I'll be the one to decide its authenticity. Sit down. Sterling sank back into his chair, his face a mask of frustration. The corporate representatives in the gallery were no longer whispering. They were staring, their faces pale, as if realizing the case was slipping away. Kennedy stepped back, letting the memo speak for itself. He'd spent months digging through records, cross-referencing cases, and piecing together a puzzle the bank thought no one would solve. But he had. And now, with the jury watching, the judge listening, and Sterling scrambling, he knew he was close to breaking the case wide open. Your Honor, Kennedy said, his voice steady, but carrying a quiet fire. This memo is just one piece of a larger pattern. The bank has been cutting corners, forging signatures, and skipping endorsements to take homes from families like mine. They thought no one would notice, because they thought no one like me would fight back. But I'm not alone. There are others out there, families who've lost everything because of these tactics. I'm asking for full discovery to uncover the full scope of what they've done." Grayson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Kennedy. "You're asking for a lot, Mr. Kennedy. If I grant this, you'd better be prepared to deliver." Kennedy met his gaze unflinching. "I am, Your Honor. I've been preparing for this my whole life." The room was silent now, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The jury, once skeptical, now looked at Kennedy with something close to awe. Sterling, his earlier arrogance gone, sat rigid, his hands clenched on the table. The corporate machine that had seemed unstoppable was starting to crack, and Kennedy was the one holding the hammer. Grayson set the memo down his fingers, tapping the bench, as he considered his next move. "I'm granting the discovery request," he said, finally his voice firm. "But Mr. Kennedy, you're on a short leash. Bring me something concrete, or this case will end quickly." Kennedy nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Your Honor. I will." The courtroom felt different now. The power dynamic shifted. Sterling's team was scrambling their whispers, frantic as they tried to regroup. The jury was no longer just listening. They were invested, their eyes following Kennedy's every move. The gallery, once so sure of the bank's victory, now buzzed with uncertainty. Kennedy stood tall, his worn suit and crooked tie no longer a mark of weakness, but a symbol of his defiance. He'd come into this courtroom as an outsider, a man they'd laughed at, dismissed as out of his depth. But he'd turned the tables piece by piece, document by document, until the bank's case was teetering on the edge. He wasn't done yet. There was one more move to make, one more truth to uncover. But for now, he'd landed a blow that shook the room, and he knew the fight was his to win. The courtroom was a different world now, the air heavy with the weight of truth exposed. John Kennedy stood at the defendant's table, his posture steady, his worn suit and slightly off-center tie no longer a source of mockery, but a badge of his unyielding resolve. The gallery, once filled with the smug whispers of corporate representatives, sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the man who had turned their expectations upside down. Bryce Sterling, the once confident corporate lawyer, slumped in his chair, his polished demeanor cracked his fingers, no longer tapping, but gripping the edge of the table as if to anchor himself against the tide of Kennedy's relentless evidence. Judge Walter Grayson, his earlier skepticism long gone, leaned forward. His glasses pushed up as he studied the stack of documents Kennedy had submitted, a forged signature, a missing mortgage endorsement, an incriminating internal memo, and a notary's damning testimony. The jury, their faces a mix of awe and conviction, hung on every word, their earlier indifference replaced by a palpable sense of investment in Kennedy's fight. The room was no longer a stage for Sterling's theatrics. It was Kennedy's arena, and he was about to deliver the final blow. Mr. Kennedy Grayson said, his voice firm, but tinged with a respect that hadn't been there at the start. "You've presented a compelling case. Do you have anything further before we proceed?" Kennedy nodded, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with purpose. "Yes, Your Honor. I have one final piece of evidence, and I believe it seals this case." Kennedy reached into his folder, pulling out a single document, its edges worn from months of careful handling. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Grayson. "This, Your Honor, is a deposition from a former employee of the bank, taken under oath just last week." Kennedy said, his voice steady, but carrying a quiet intensity. "It confirms that the bank's foreclosure department was under direct orders to prioritize speed over accuracy, forging documents and skipping endorsements to meet aggressive quotas. This employee, who worked in the department for 5 years, states that my family's case was one of many handled this way. The courtroom stirred a low murmur, rippling through the gallery. Sterling shot to his feet, his voice strained, almost desperate. "Objection, Your Honor. This deposition is hearsay, and its authenticity is questionable." But Grayson silenced him with a sharp look. "Overruled, Mr. Sterling. I've seen enough to trust Mr. Kennedy's diligence. I'll review this myself." Sterling sank back into his chair, his face pale, his earlier arrogance reduced to a shadow. The jury leaned forward, their eyes locked on Kennedy, sensing the case was reaching its climax. Grayson skimmed the deposition, his brow furrowing as he absorbed its contents. "Mr. Kennedy," he said, setting the document down, "this is a serious accusation. You're saying the bank knowingly engaged in fraudulent practices, not just in your case, but as a matter of policy." Kennedy nodded, his voice unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. This isn't just about my family's home. It's about a system that preys on people who don't have the means to fight back. They thought we wouldn't notice, wouldn't stand up. But I did. And I'm asking this court to hold them accountable." He turned to the jury, his gaze steady, connecting with each of them. "You've seen the evidence: forged signatures, missing endorsements, a memo pushing illegal shortcuts, and now a whistleblower confirming it all. This bank took my family's home without legal right, and they've done it to others. I'm asking you to give us justice, not just for my family, but for everyone they've hurt." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a tide. The jury nodded slightly, some with glassy eyes, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and admiration. Grayson leaned back, his fingers tapping the bench as he considered the case. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his tone sharp, "do you have anything to counter this evidence?" Sterling stood, his movements slow, his voice lacking its earlier polish. "Your Honor, my client followed standard foreclosure procedures. The defendant's claims, while dramatic, don't change the fact that the loan was in default." But his words fell flat. The jury unmoved, their eyes still on Kennedy. Grayson shook his head, his patience gone. "Mr. Sterling, I've seen forged signatures, missing endorsements, and now a deposition suggesting systemic fraud. That's not standard procedure. I'm ready to rule." The room held its breath, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. Kennedy stood still, his heart pounding but his face composed. He'd fought for this moment, poured everything into it. Months of research, sleepless nights, and a fire that refused to be extinguished. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly, his voice steady but resonant. "Based on the evidence presented, including forged documents, improper notarization, and testimony suggesting deliberate misconduct, this court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is nullified, and the property is to be returned to the Kennedy family immediately." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a wave of murmurs. The jury nodded, some smiling, others whispering in approval. The corporate representatives sat frozen, their faces a mix of shock and resignation. Sterling stared at the table, his hands clenched, his defeat written in every line of his body. Kennedy let out a slow breath, the weight of months, years of struggle lifting from his shoulders. His family's home was safe, the place where his parents had built their lives, where memories were woven into every corner, preserved because he refused to back down. But this wasn't just about winning. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond the courtroom. Grayson looked at Kennedy, his expression no longer dismissive, but thoughtful. "Mr. Kennedy," he said, his voice carrying a rare warmth, "you've done something remarkable here. Not many could walk into this room and do what you did." Kennedy nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Thank you. Your Honor, I just did what was right. As the courtroom began to clear, the gallery buzzing with hushed conversations, Kennedy gathered his papers, his movements slow, deliberate. The weight of the fight was still there, but it was lighter now, tempered by the knowledge that he'd won not just for his family, but for everyone who'd been dismissed, underestimated, or pushed aside. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps, the air cool and sharp. Kennedy paused, taking a deep breath, the reality of his victory settling in. A few people from the gallery lingered nearby, their voices carrying snippets of awe. Never saw that coming, and he took them apart. But Kennedy didn't need their praise. He'd fought for justice, not validation, and he'd gotten it. A voice called out from behind him. "Kennedy!" He turned to see Grayson standing at the top of the steps. Hands in his pockets, his usual sternness softened. "You ever think about law school?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Kennedy chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe someday, Your Honor." Grayson nodded, his eyes lingering on him for a moment before he turned and disappeared back into the courthouse. Kennedy stepped down the stairs, the world feeling different now. Not easier, not perfect, but real. The lesson wasn't just in the victory, it was in the fight itself. He'd learned that justice isn't handed out. It's earned through persistence, preparation, and an unshakable belief in what's right. The bank had underestimated him, laughed at him, thought he was nothing. But he'd shown them and the world that power doesn't belong only to those with money or titles. It belongs to anyone willing to stand up to dig for the truth, to refuse to be silenced. For every family who'd lost their home, for every person who'd been dismissed, Kennedy's fight was a reminder you don't need a degree or a fancy suit to make a difference. You just need the courage to try. And as he walked away, the sun setting behind him, he knew that if anyone ever came for what was his again, they'd find him ready, because the underestimated always have the most to prove. And when they get their chance, they don't just win. They change everything.